What is it about turning 40 years old? You know, there's certain milestones that people want to always acknowledge. You don't necessarily acknowledge about yourself, but other people want to let you know. You know, you remember the time a lot of you went through that. You turned 40 years old, and everybody wants to let you know that now you're 40 years old. Maybe some of you are approaching that, and you're sort of anticipating. You know, what is meant by that number 40? You know, maybe it's an opportunity for you to, I guess, be a little bit fearful, look at your past and say, well, what have I or what have I not accomplished so far? Or maybe thinking about going to the future and saying, well, you know, how much time do I have left to finish this or to do this or to do that? Why is it 40? Is it something about that particular number? I want you to think about that number 40 tonight and not necessarily think about the idea of 40 years, but instead just 40 days. You know, what can you accomplish in just a matter of 40 days? Can you even think about that far ahead right now? If I were to say, in 40 days from now, where will you be? What comes to mind? You know, do you think about, you know, I don't even know when that is. Let me tell you when that is. Friday, August the 15th, 40 days later. Where will you be? What will you have done? It's kind of hard to think about. You know, if I were to tell you to, you know, in 40 days, if you were to go to the gym for the next 40 days, how much stronger will you be by the 40th day? I think all of us would easily say, you know, no matter where I'm at right now, you would be stronger. If I were to say something like, for the next 40 days, I want you to walk 3 miles every single day, everyone would say, well, yes, I'll be healthier. What can you accomplish in just 40 days? John Maxwell, who writes a lot of books, most of his books are about really leadership and training. And in one of his particular books, he talks about the idea of having a plan moving forward and what you can accomplish in the next 40 days. And as I read these, I just want you to kind of, as you see them there, think about yourself and where you fall under the next 40-day plan. He says, unproductive people go into the day with no plan. Is that you? He says the average person goes into the day with a plan for that day only. Does that describe you? He says above average people have a plan for the week, and he says the top performers know what needs to be the day for the next 30 plus days of your life. He said the people that are the most successful have a plan for the next 40 days, whether we're talking, you know, from a spiritual sense of growing, whether you're talking in a business sense, a health sense, or whatever, you have the mindset and you sat down and said, this is what the next 40 days looks like. What will you accomplish in the next 40 days? I know on the one hand, that's hard for us to kind of wrap our minds around because we do have some verses like Matthew 6:34 that talks about the idea of, you know, don't worry, tomorrow has its own worries. Or the verse in James 4:14 where it says, you know, don't say you'll do this or that tomorrow, for what do you know, your life is such a vapor. And so you're like, well, we're not necessarily supposed to plan for the future. We're not supposed to look toward to the future. We just need to live today for today. And then if tomorrow comes, we'll live tomorrow. But I mean, practically speaking, we don't really live that way. You know, we live with a plan. We make plans all the time. We book vacations months in advance, don't we? You have retirement plans that are a year in advance. So we don't always necessarily follow this guideline of these verses. What plans do you have for the next 40 days? I think we talk about plans and this idea of the sense of goals. You know, what is your goal? What do you want to accomplish in the next 40 days? So what I want you to do tonight is I want us to just look and see what can happen in the next 40 days. And I want us to specifically, we're going to look at verses because believe it or not, the Bible has a lot of different examples of stories that are attached to this idea of 40 days of what could happen. And so that's kind of what I want us to look at tonight. And we won't necessarily spend in great detail on each one of these because there's several of them, but most of them you probably heard before, so you got kind of an idea of where they're going or what the story's about already. The first story that we come across in the Bible that talks about this idea of 40 days is Genesis chapter 6, the story of the flood. And as you know, God comes to Noah and he gives him these instructions of how to build a boat, how to build an ark. He gives them the specifics of dimensions and how big and what to use. And so Noah goes to work. He builds this large boat for one day it's going to rain. And at some point in time, God has finally said that, it's time, go into the ark. Noah and his family goes into the ark. We know along with some of the animals, God shuts the door, and then it rains. And it rains, and it rains. In fact, do you remember how many days it rained? 40 days. Genesis 7:12 talks about it raining for 40 days and 40 nights. That was a lot of water. It was so much water that it said it covered the whole earth. And if you keep reading there, I think it's in the next chapter, maybe around verse 10 or 11 or 12, where it talks about even after it stopped raining, the ark basically floated there for 110 days until it finally landed on top of one of the mountains. A lot can happen in 40 days. God can completely wipe out not just a city, not just a nation, not just a country, but the whole world can be covered in just a matter of 40 days. Now, we're blessed to know that God said, I'll never do that again. He gives us the rainbow as that sign of not flooding the world again. But spiritually speaking, what can happen in just a matter of 40 days? How quickly things can go where it seems like everything is comfortable, I've got everything I need, and you can lose everything in 40 days. Can you lose your faith in God in just 40 days? Can you drown in just 40 days if you don't have a boat? If you don't have somewhere to secure yourself in, can you lose hope in just 40 days? I'm sure the many people that were outside seeing the rain, as it continued to rain and rain and rain, and eventually they had nowhere to go, they lost hope in just a matter of a few days. What do you do when the rain comes? What do you do when the trials and temptations come? Where's our trust? We have to be very cautious of where we put our trust in. It's very easy for us to put our trust in ourselves these days, where we try to take care of everything on our own and we think we have everything under control. But we might wake up one day and realize that we're not in control, realize that we don't have a grip on things, and wonder even how we got so far away from God in such a short period of time. Maybe you're even thinking that right now. Well, let me ask you, do you have a plan? Do you have a plan to be in a relationship with God, to be with God? Do you have a plan to help focus on that relationship with God? Do you surround yourself with positive influences? We read about that in Hebrews chapter 12. We've been surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. Have you surrounded yourself with positive influences? Do you have a secure place to go? It's very easy to fall back and even to drown in this sense in your faith if you don't put yourself in the right surroundings. I think about Noah and I think about his family, and I'm sure it was a very, difficult situation even for them, being on this ark and seeing the destruction around them and knowing what was happening, but they still understood that who was in control? That God was with them the whole time, even when they were going through that. A lot can happen in 40 days. What about Moses? We see a few stories involving Moses in this idea of 40 days. One is found in Exodus chapter 24 at verse 18. Moses goes up to Mount Sinai. He's going to be there for 40 days and 40 nights. This is where he receives the commandments from God. So he's going to have this sort of direct communication, this direct, time with God to see what the next step for the people is going to be. He gains this understanding over the next 40 days. He sees what God's expectations are for the people. He writes down these, what we call the 10 commandments on these stones, and brings them down. I wonder what would happen if you and I really dedicated the next 40 days and 40 nights to only spend with God. Intently studying the Scriptures, looking at what God's Word really has to say, not just reading, but actually studying the Scriptures. Maybe knocking out and taking out any other distractions that we have in our life that take up so much of our time every day. What would happen if all of us said, I'm putting my phone away for 40 days? I'm getting off social media for 40 days. I'm not turning the TV on for 40 days. I'm not doing any extracurricular activities for 40 days. And all that time that we would spend on those things, we said, I'm going to give that time to God instead. A lot can happen in 40 days. I wonder how much more insightful we would be and have clarity on what God's instruction would be for our lives if we would just simply go through the steps of doing that for the next 40 days. A lot can happen. I know especially when we talk about the phone and we talk about social media and we talk about things and we don't really realize how much time we spend on that until once a week you'll get a notification that tells you how many hours an average you spend per day on your phone. And then you sort of recognize, well, maybe it is time to sort of cut back a little bit. Moses spent this one-on-one time with God for 40 days and 40 nights. A lot can happen in just 40 days. You know, later on in Moses, some of the stuff that we read there, in Deuteronomy 9, Moses basically, he goes and he intercedes to God for the people. He prays fervently for the people on behalf of them for 40 days and 40 nights. And the reason he does that is because the Lord was ready to destroy them for their disobedience. Remember the story of the golden calf. And again, this goes back to the idea of, I wonder what we could accomplish if we really spent our time with God. Specifically, maybe looking at this story of saying, I'm going to specifically and intently spend 40 days in prayer to God. Any free time that I have, I'm going to pray to God about it. And I'm not gonna just kind of casually pray. I'm not just going to use vain repetitions, but I'm going to write down, maybe you or me, we think about, 5 very specific things that are going on. And I'm going to pray specifically for all of those for the next 40 days. Maybe it's certain people that you're close to that are sick. Maybe it's this country. Maybe it's the lost souls that are around us in the community. For every one of us, you may think of something very specific to say, for the next 40 days, I'm going to pray intently about these things and talk to God about them. A lot can happen in 40 days. But what are your plans for the next 40 days is the question. Otherwise, we'll wake up Friday, August the 15th, 40 days from now, and nothing is different. Nothing is different because we didn't make a plan to do something differently. You remember in Numbers chapter 13, the 12 spies were sent out to look over the land of Canaan. They went out to scope out the land. We're going to send the people in there. And you remember how long they were there? You can probably guess by now. 40 days. And they came to the conclusion, at least most of them came to the conclusion, 10 of the 12, that just in a matter of 40 days, they decided that they could not move forward. They could not, in fact, go to this land that God had blessed them. They could not defeat the people that were there. They were doomed to fail. You remember what they said? They said, we're like grasshoppers and they're like giants. There's no way we're going to be wiped out. In just a matter of 40 days, they had forgotten all the things that God had done for them. And unfortunately, the people listened. Spiritually speaking, what can happen in 40 days? Have you ever gone through a very difficult situation? A 40-day period of feeling like a great obstacle is right in front of you? and you have to make some big decision about what direction you're going to go. Should you move forward? Should you divert? Should you go backward and retreat? Maybe you're even going through one of those right now. And all we're asking is, when we think about these things that we go through, is in those times, do we think whether we should trust God or whether we should trust ourselves? When we hit those serious moments where decisions have to be made about our future, do we consider God's plans for us? Or does it always seem like every little obstacle that comes up in our life, we're all of a sudden turn and we start questioning God. We start questioning His love for us. We start questioning, does He really have a path for us? We wonder if we're really doing His will. We wonder if He really loves us. We wonder if He's really with us or not. I think about the apostles in 2 Corinthians 1:9, this humbling experience that they had when it talks about their dependence on God, where they sort of make this statement of they were hard pressed. They thought they were going into something that they could not overcome. A lot can happen in 40 days. We can grow in our faith, or our faith can be weakened in just a matter of 40 days. As we see this group of scared men here, that instead of trusting God and what God has said, all the people were doomed, we see the next story that comes up. And the next story comes up is in 1 Samuel 17. And we almost see the exact same thing of fear overcome the people if it wasn't for just one person. And you're probably most familiar, 1 Samuel chapter 17 is the story of David and Goliath. This Philistine giant named Goliath, he comes out and he is taunting King Saul. He's taunting the armies. And even the way that the scriptures describe this story, they give you a picture in detail of who Goliath was. He is this champion from a very young age. He's always been a warrior. It talks about how tall he is and how much his armor weighs and how he is a champion. It's kind of allowing us a little bit to, I guess, at least be a little sympathetic of the people who are afraid when they think about what their size was compared to what the giant size was. We can kind of put ourselves in those shoes a little bit and say, well, I wouldn't want to go up against that. In 1 Samuel 17:16, it says Goliath came out and he taunted Saul's army for 40 days. Maybe their fate would have been the same as those of the spies and on who would have listened to them if it wouldn't have been for this one teenage shepherd who just happens to show up, right? He just happens to show up. His father sends him to check on his older brothers and to give supplies, and then David hears what is going on. And as you know the story, David questions and says, well, who is going to go fight this? Who does he think he is? And eventually David would say, I'll go out there and fight him. I am not afraid to go out there and fight him. And that's exactly what happens as we read the scriptures. As David goes out and he not only says, I'm going to go fight him, but he goes and he defeats him. He slays the giant. I want you to think about that just in the stance we think about what can happen in 40 days. You can go through 40 days of fear, but that fear can quickly go away. It can be overcome by a faithful response and faithful actions. I think about, spiritually from a standpoint of all of us. We've been fearful of things before. Sometimes we reject God because we're scared to stand up. But what do we do when we recognize that? Do we keep living that life, or do we change and do we turn and do we repent for our lack of faith and trust? I look about this story specifically for us tonight, and we think about what can happen in 40 days. I would just say you don't have to remain in that state of fear, and sometimes it just takes somebody else in our lives to stand up and to show courage and to show us what faithful living looks like. For us to recognize that we don't have to be afraid. We don't have to be fearful of things in this world. Sometimes we need that example around us to see, again, someone else step out on their faith to show the rest of us how it's done. you can be that person as well. Maybe for other people in your lives that just need that example, maybe has found themselves in sort of a rut of fear and a lack of faith, you can be that example to stand up and show them how to live a faithful life. A lot can happen in 40 days. If you go over to 1 Kings chapter 19, the last story we see in the Old Testament, chapter 2 before this, we see the great, dramatic victory of Elijah and the prophets of Baal, and what happens on Mount Carmel. But then we see in chapter 19, Elijah goes through this great crisis of faith of his own. He hears about what Jezebel wants to do, wants to destroy him, wants to take his life, and all of a sudden we see Elijah running. He goes away, he goes into the wilderness, he goes and hides, and he finds himself sleeping under a tree, and then he's woken up not once but twice by an angel who tells him to get up and to eat. 1 Kings 19:8. Get up and drink. Here's something that I'm providing for you. God is providing for him to recognize that he's not alone. And after he fills himself with the things that God provides, it talks about him traveling for 40 days to the mountain to meet God. And I think about that story, and I think about just the fact that no one is beyond struggles. We look at Elijah as a man of a great faith, a great prophet, but yet even he struggled sometimes. And in all of us, our own weak moments, we all have them. No matter how great the past victories may be, no matter what all we accomplish in the name of God, just like Elijah, sometimes we need to allow God to provide for us. We need to just listen and trust him, no matter what the situation is. The great proverb that's quoted all the time is Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Trust the Lord, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways, submit to him, and he'll make your paths straight. Elijah himself at this point in time receives this nourishment from God that he needs, and he spends this next 40 days walking toward God, walking to where God is, getting back to where he needs to be, which is in the presence of God. I think also sometimes we just need that spark to get us going in the right direction. Are we listening to God? A lot can happen in 40 days. As you turn to the New Testament, we come across two particular stories that talk again about this idea of 40 days. One of them, you can probably know both of them already, but the first one is right after Jesus is baptized. It says he was led by the Spirit in the wilderness, and he fasted for 40 days. And we read after those 40 days, we read in Matthew 4 how the devil came to tempt Jesus in three very specific ways. It's the ways that all sin or all temptation comes our way. 1 John 2:16 talks about how, basically every sin falls under either the idea of it's the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, or the pride of life. And so that's what the devil presents Jesus in these occasions of tempting him. But I want you to pay close attention to Matthew chapter 4, verse 1, in the wording there, where it says, Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. The implication, the idea there is Jesus and the Spirit knew that temptation was coming. This was not something that was going to catch Jesus off guard. He knew that Satan was going to come after him. And so what did Jesus do to prepare himself? He went to the wilderness. He got away from all the distractions, and he spent time with God. He fasted for 40 days. No distractions, total focus, total attention only on him and the Father. And I'm sure there were even times in Jesus' ministry that we see that people, even the disciples, didn't understand the occasions where Jesus would get up early in the morning and he would leave the rest to go and pray with his Father. The times where he would go and he would pray through the night. I'm sure his disciples didn't exactly understand, why is he doing that if he is God? Or why is he doing that when there are people, as Peter even comes to him on one occasion and says, where are you, Jesus? People are looking for you. Jesus understood the importance of spending time with his Father. And specifically on this occasion, it says he spends 40 days. Have you ever fasted? Have you ever thought about fasting? Have you ever thought about the need to fast? I think there are some things that we call fasting that is not really fasting. From the time you eat supper to the next morning, the 12 hours, that's not fasting, okay? There's things in, weight loss management we call intermittent fasting now. That's 16, 20 hours of not eating. That is not fasting. Have you ever fasted? Have we sort of totally even pushed that away of even a thought or an idea of something that could help us that we've never even thought about doing it? Jesus did it. In fact, the earlier story, Moses did it. There's some speculation, not 100% sure, if Elijah during his 40 days he fasted. Fasting is an opportunity for you to get away from anything and everything that is distracting you in this world, not relying on physical things, instead relying on God and God alone. Instead of turning to physical substance when you're hungry, you turn to the Scriptures for spiritual substance. And you go through this time where you understand that Jesus, that God, the Word is the only thing that I really need. Maybe the reason we fall into temptation so often is that we have not even trained ourselves to say no to the world. We're so easily tempted. We so easily are falling into temptation. Going back to that verse in 1 John that he writes, 1 John 2:15, where he says, do not love the world, nor the things that are in the world. If anyone loves the Father, if anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. Have we learned to say no to the world? A lot could happen in 40 days. The other story that we see, and the last one we'll look at, is about Jesus and what happened after the resurrection. Jesus' story, the miraculous event of the emptying of the tomb, his story didn't end there. Although that's the great significance, we still read, as Acts chapter 1, verse 3 tells us, that Jesus still spent 40 days with the people, with his disciples after his resurrection. And we say, well, why did he do that? Or what did he do? Well, you keep reading and you see that he continued to essentially prepare his disciples for what is to come. We see the story, we have a couple of those stories where we see, the road to Emmaus, that he talks to the couple of gentlemen that didn't recognize it was him. We see the story of Jesus showing up and talking to his disciples, where Thomas didn't believe and then he believed the next time. But 1 Corinthians 15:6 tells us that Jesus appeared to over 500 people at one time. And we also see it was after the resurrection, right before his ascension, is when he gives his final instructions to the disciples. We recognize this often as we think about, we call it the Great Commission in the end of Matthew and the end of Mark and so on, where he says, go into all the world and make disciples, baptizing them, teaching them to observe all the things that I've taught them. Do you think there was a confidence? There was a growing confidence, a confirmation after the resurrection that his disciples received by spending that time with Jesus. A lot can happen in just a matter of 40 days. That's the whole point tonight. In just a few short days, it may seem like a long time, only 40 days, a lot can happen. Faith can be renewed. Faith can be reassured. People's fears can be removed. Hope can be restored. But you can also go the other direction as well in just a matter of 40 days and walk away from God completely if you don't have a plan. So the question for all of us tonight is, what will we do with the next 40 days? 40 days from now, Friday, August the 15th, will you be stronger? Will you be the same? Will you be weaker? Or a lot of that depends on what you do starting when you get up tomorrow. What is your plan for tomorrow? What is your plan for the day after that, and the day after that, and the day after that? Are you just going and saying, well, I'm just going to live one day at a time and just whatever happens, happens? Or are you going to put a plan together? A plan to grow in your faith. A plan to get closer with God. A lot can happen in 40 days. You know, at the end of all of our lessons, we offer the Lord's invitation. You know, the Lord's invitation is open to anyone and everyone. It's not just for specific people. It's open to anyone who needs prayers from the church. If you have things you need to take care of, there are weaknesses that you have right now that you're saying, you know, I've just been weak and I've been trying to do it on my own and I can't do it on my own. I need prayers. I need help from my church family. If you've been studying the gospel message and you're ready to obey the gospel, we can take care of that tonight. Just know that the invitation is open to all as we stand and sing.